coming up.
Minister Anand and General Wayne Eyre, going back a couple of years ago, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started with Russia, said that Canada and the defense industry must be moved to war footing. Do you feel confident that the government's given you the proper direction and contracts to move Canada onto a war footing?
Building of an innovative and effective defense industrial base, which leads me to the fact that we've had an underinvestment in our military over the last number of years, and in that we've seen kind of a stagnating growth potential in defense industry. So where would you suggest the government directs its investments?
The Prime Minister has said at the NATO summit that Canada will hit our minimum 2% spending by 2032 or within 8 years. And they're claiming a cabinet confidence to refuse to provide a plan. Are you confident in that estimate, or is it just a number they made up to placate our allies' frustration over our lack of contribution?
So that's not a plan. That's a press release.
It's preferable that parties, again, depoliticize and look to, on these very important issues, create things like, agreements or, go into partnerships. One may even say coalitions. I don't know.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Welcome, Mike Mueller, President and Chief Executive Officer of Aerospace Industries. Christian Cianfrani. Pretty good, eh? Do you know that we've got a phonetic spelling here? Cianfrani. Well done. Thank you very much. President and Chief Executive Officer, Canadian Association of Defence and Security Industries, and Brian Gallant, Chief Executive Officer of Space Canada, and host of a brilliant event last night. So,
Ms. Cianfrani, yesterday, Kathy posted on LinkedIn saying the United States Defense and Security inform every aspect of a bilateral relationship. To be taken seriously in Washington, Canada must begin laying out a transparent year-over-year fiscal track to meet its NATO commitments. And that was linked to a news story that headlined, "The U.S. needs a few good allies. Does it still need Canada?" Can you answer that question? Does the U.S. still need Canada?
I think it does need Canada, of course. We are the northern flank, if you want to call it that. We have a responsibility under NORAD to defend the Arctic territories, and we know the proximity to Russia and China's interventions in the north are our responsibility. So yes, the United States very much does need Canada to be an active, engaged, and funding partner, in particular of NORAD.
So, in the decision and announcement by Minister Jolie that Canada was going to no longer import or export any material that's used in defense weapons that might end up in Israel's hands, does that again undermine the relationship between us and the United States?
So,
or can you tell us how your contacts in the U.S. are viewing that decision? Because they might be exporting to some of our other allies, but they can't get, because they might have a client in Israel and the IDF, might not be able to get, into the supply chain parts from Canada.
So the concern that industry has is we never question the decision that is made because the government is our regulator. So we will comply with whatever the Canadian government decides with respect to what goods can go to what particular countries. But we do take two exceptions in the case of the way in which the decision was made to, let's call it, ban extraterritorial, perhaps, exports to Israel through the United States. One is in the way in which it was transmitted to industry, which is, again, us learning about something of this magnitude in an ad hoc media conversation. What is worse is that the department at this point in time is unable to clarify for us, for the sector, to what degree this decision extends. Meaning, does it extend to parts and components within platforms like F-35, for example? And because the department cannot give us clarity on that, there is a concern coming out of industry that this will harm 50% of our market share, which is our export market with the United States, largely serviced under the Defense Production Sharing Agreement. So yes, there is much nervousness as we are one of the biggest supply chain partners for United States platform manufacturers.
Yeah, and that, you mentioned F-35. That also goes to the Stryker, right?
That Canadians have parts and components on, right? Not uniquely some of the major platforms.
Okay. Now, were you or any of the three of you consulted by the government in the development of the DPU? Was industry talked to about it? Yeah, all three, good, because we didn't have that with academics. Now, I know that at a CATSI conference not that long ago, that Minister Anand and General Wayne Eyre, going back a couple of years ago, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started with Russia, said that Canada and the defense industry must be moved to war footing. Do you feel confident that the government's given you the proper direction and contracts to move Canada onto a war footing?
No, we are not on a war footing whatsoever. The urgency and let's call it the paperwork, if you want to call it that, the firmness of the relationship that would allow industry to go to a war footing is not there for certain aspects that are required particularly in the war in Ukraine, whether that be ammunition, which is still missing contracting vehicles right now, or other goods and services, right? I mean, we are just not in a state of high alert, and we are not operating with a sense of urgency that we see other partners operating with.
So both Mr. Mueller and Ms. Cianfrani, you guys mentioned the billion-dollar cuts that are coming in the defense budget. So we talk about giving more money to national defense, but then cutting it back under Treasury Board guidelines. And that's impacted industry more than anything else. Is that impacting upon the maintenance of some of our legacy systems?
I would say, thank you for the question. A lot of concerns about the cuts. I'm not aware of any of the actual maintenance side of things, but it's more on the operational side of things that we see some impacts, some happening. But I think just going back to the earlier comments on the DPU, it's a very aspirational document, but it's lacking that concrete actions on how you're going to operationalize it. And that's really what we're looking for. It's how do you get the operationalization of the document? And it just doesn't make sense from an industry perspective to have money and then cuts
interject there.
on the other
so
way.
It doesn't operationalize it. We know that the DPU was created in a vacuum, that it doesn't have a formed policy, to go along with it. There isn't the defense industrial strategy to go along with it. There isn't a national security strategy to support it either. So without those policies, how do you operationalize it then?
We're going to have to leave those questions in a vacuum. So, with that, Madame LeBlanc.
What specific elements do you envision being part of an industrial aerospace strategy that would complement the defense policy update? And I have a second part to my question, which is, how would such a strategy address the gaps in Canada's current aerospace defense sector?
Thank you for the question. And again, we're very appreciative of the government's commitment for that aerospace strategy through Minister Champagne. An aerospace strategy will provide predictability and certainty for industry. So you ask about a couple things that need to be a part of that. The defense component absolutely needs to be a part of that. And one of the areas that we're really looking for is how do you define out what are the sovereign capabilities and capacities we need as a country? We talk about moving to war footing and things like this, but as a country we need to have a clear understanding of what is the capacity and what's the capabilities we need here from a defense perspective, from an economic prosperity perspective. So we need to do that hard work with respect to that strategy. But strategy is absolutely critical to, again, operationalize the aspirational pieces of the defense policy update that was released.
And How does this policy position of Canada's aerospace industry, how does it help us compete internationally, especially in terms of partnerships and exports?
Well, you look internationally, and I'd mentioned Australia, but you look at the UK, you look at the EU, you look at the US, they all have defense industrial strategies. And it really provides industry the certainty on where to invest, on where the government is going, where the country is going, because right now we're stuck into a cycle of a transactional approach to defense procurement. And without that strategy in place, how do you start to align all the different things that need to be discussed? I was listening to the earlier panel, and workforce development is an example. So you have the CAF that's struggling with that. You have industry that's struggling with that also. But without that strategy in place to, again, operationalize and institutionalize the aspirational parts of the defense policy update, we're left in that vacuum again of not knowing where to invest, where we're going to go, what are the timelines, and that's absolutely critical.
In your opinion, what do you see as the key strengths of the new policy and of Canada's aerospace sector, and do you believe these strengths will have long-term benefits for the industry?
So we were consulted by two previous defense ministers on the defense policy update, and we were pleased to see some of the language that we had proposed within that. One, making sure that there is consultation with industry and that renewed relationship with industry. 4-year review, again, incredibly important. So again, there's very good things within the defense policy update, but it is what's next. You know, the industrial policy that is required to align this. How do we institutionalize and operationalize that new relationship that the minister has put down? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we need to send that signal to industry, to our international allies, and our competitors also.
Would the other two witnesses like to add to that question?
I think certainly having some of the capabilities, and in the case of the DPU, it really looks more like equipment purchases than it does like capabilities. So it's described as we're going to buy these things. I think that at least gives a signal to industry about what direction we're going to go in terms of what we're going to buy. So from that perspective, it does contain important and very necessary commitments to how we are going to start to build up our defense industrial base. What it doesn't do, though, is distinguish between what will be sovereign and protected, if you want to call it that, and what we will acquire from other nations. So that's like a shortcoming of the policy itself. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I would simply add to my colleagues' comments that it's great to have a plan, and certainly I want to acknowledge that the update, the review contains some elements that we think are important for space, and it felt like there was a bit more of a recognition of the importance of space when it comes to defense. But a plan is sort of worth what it's written on, in the sense that unless you actually execute and procure the things you plan to do, then it's not really worth much. So certainly we are concerned of the delays in procurement in defense in general, and then even more specifically for space-related defense capabilities. We think that space is a very innovative sector, and if it takes years to procure something that you think you needed 7 years ago, whatever the case might be, then what you actually end up getting through that journey of procurement might be outdated. So certainly we would just like to see these investments made as quick as possible. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we can kind of come and say that, and we've said that to the minister and the team. We can say that, but unless there is some type of structural change to figure that out, then we're going to be waiting for some of the investments that I think are good from a space perspective to actually come to fruition. And certainly, let me just add as well, I'm of the view that we need to get to 2% to meet our NATO target for various reasons. And I'll just add this isn't really with my Space Canada hat on, more so just as a Canadian citizen, but We had a Democratic president on the floor of Parliament, Barack Obama, when he visited, and all positive, except he addressed the fact that we need to invest more when it comes to defense. And then we have a obviously former, but at the time current president in Trump, a Republican, obviously saying the same. So both parties in the U.S. are saying it, and they're saying it for a reason, maybe different reasons, but nevertheless, they're hearing that, or it's a very palatable argument that will resonate with Americans for the U.S. to be able to retreat from important international institutions that we need to be a part of.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there.
I just wanted to clarify, Ms. Sian Ferrani. Okay. You said that the department didn't give you any clarity on the changing of those arms exports in enough time or with any sort of clarity. Like, they still haven't to date given you that clarity that the industry needs. That's correct. That's what you said? Okay. So that's interesting. If Canada was consistent in how we treat our arms exports in terms of sticking and being consistent to those nations that violate international law, would that provide the industry with the clarity and the consistency that it needed?
I think there is an element of predictability that we would like to have, but we do recognize that this is an area where the government will take decisions that the industry may or may not be in a response to an action by another nation, right? So we understand that there may be a speed at which decisions are made that we have no influence on. So predictability, yes. I think for us is once a decision is made, it is that we can go to the department, and the department is very, very clear on what that good, service, product, whatever, what, how, and to the degree to which it will be restricted from its exportability. And so the inability for us to get those answers and then companies to adjust their practices immediately is the most problematic aspect of it, notwithstanding the fact that it's unpredictable, and that the method by which we are often informed is in a public domain space as opposed to being sort of pre-informed before a decision like that is made. So given sort of a warning that this may transpire.
You represent quite a few, yes, companies, but I would imagine that many of them, they don't necessarily wait for a government to make those decisions, especially when we're talking about the violation or the instigation of war crimes. Those are individual decisions as well for industry.
Companies will not make those decisions on their own because they don't have access to the information that the government has to be able to make those decisions. So they wait for the government to signal that there is a challenge in a particular country with a particular good, and then we wait for the details of how that export and or sanction will roll itself out.
Just to shift gears a little bit, I've certainly talked a lot about, and we've heard from this committee a lot about the aligning of defense policy with industrial policy, that we need the robust domestic industry to get where we need to be. That Made in Canada approach that I've often tried to discuss at this committee ensures that we're spending the money, taxpayers' money within Canada to benefit Canadians, to benefit workers. Can you talk about that a bit more in terms of how the DPU is or is not addressing that?
Yeah, the DPU strangely addresses it, but only in reference to a defense industrial strategy. So by nature, what you would do is you would have this defense industrial strategy or defense industrial policy. You would identify key capability areas where you want sovereign capability within the country, and then you would align all your programming processes and procurements around ensuring that that sovereign capability remained within Canada. You would also decide what you were going to purchase from your allies at that same time. So, for example, if we feel that airframe platforms are largely going to come from our allies and that we will be more interested in parts, components, sensors, and things like that, we would articulate that in a defense industrial strategy, and then we would let that guide us when it comes to making decisions about what we're procuring and the speed at which we procure those things. In other words, sole sourcing from Canadian firms, for example.
I've heard from a lot of companies that within Canada, they don't bid on Canadian contracts because either the process is too complicated or because of Canada's over-reliance on what they call urgent operating requirement procurement, so filling in short-term very quickly. They can't meet that need. I certainly heard that today. Could all of you comment on that as well?
First?
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. The complexity of the procurement process is incredible, and I'll just give you one anecdote from a company bidding on a same-size contract in the U.S. and in Canada. In the U.S., it is a binder full of information that they're asking, and in Canada, they weighted, and I think it was 45 pounds of paper. So. Just the amount of material that's being generated oftentimes on this is incredible. So there's definitely ways to streamline the procurement, make it risk-based approaches. So do you need the amount of information for something very simple? But there's definitely, and we've put in some recommendations on that. So it is a huge issue. It's one of the concerns I have with the DPU. Lots of money there. How do we get the money out quickly, effectively, to actually make a difference on some of these things?
I want to draw attention to a statement in the DPU that says, quote, building of an innovative and effective defense industrial base, which leads me to the fact that we've had underinvestment in our military over the last number of years, and in that we've seen kind of a stagnating growth potential in defense industry. So where would you suggest the government directs its investments in defense to create homegrown manufacturing, both in hardcore manufacturing, but also in creating IP that can then be exported to our allies and thereby create a greater GDP for Canada and the defense industry?
Can I make a small correction in your statement? So the defense industry has actually grown 10% over the last few years because of the injection of basically the world market demand for defense-related goods. So I think that's important to contextualize. It's not, there is demand. To your point on Canadian competency, we have incredible Canadian competency in space, as my colleagues alluded to. In fact, we're world leaders in space and space exploration. We have incredible Canadian competency in things like, well, you were talking about it earlier, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. We have incredible Canadian capability on the conventional defense side in sensor and sensing capabilities, in underwater capabilities. We run our shipbuilding programs, and in land vehicles, in particular light armored vehicles and other lighter armor, light APVs. So those are just some areas. I mean, I could continue listing them. Maybe my colleague can give you some examples in the aerospace domain.
Well, I think you actually have to step back, and it's what we need to do this together. And we talked about the foreign policy, we talked about the industrial policy. You need to make sure that everything is aligning and you identify the capabilities that is required. And industry and government needs to come together to do that, to define out what is required from our defense capabilities, what's required from an economic perspective, so that hard work has to come. I think the DPU sets the stage for that, but we haven't seen the follow-up to any of those pieces yet. But I think you've identified very correctly what the issue is.
Is there adequate amounts of Canadian IP being incorporated into the products that are being manufactured in Canada?
those that are
intellectual properties.
manufactured.
Yeah.
In Canada, yes.
Yeah.
I think the bigger question is on some of the other procurements, how do you make sure you have the intellectual property, again, to find out on what the core capabilities we need is incorporated into some of those.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be brief. You all mentioned about industrial policy, strategy, and the importance. You just referred to all your members and the enormous capabilities that Canadian company can offer. We talked all the time about innovation, creativity, being ready to help, our defense team here. Could you be more specific in terms of, as we are writing a report, industrial policy or strategy? I know there was some reference, but you know the industries, you know who is the actor. If you were to suggest to us as parliamentarian, what would you like to see more specifically into the industrial strategy? And I know there was policy mentioned.
Take a crack from an aerospace perspective again. Thank you for the question. Again, very positive signals from the government and Minister Champagne with respect to that. Defense has to be a part of it. We talked about operationalizing and institutionalizing the DPU, absolutely critical. Reforms to procurement to give that certainty, predictability that's there. Innovation is a huge piece. How are we supporting innovation, both on the defense side and then the civil side, and what's the crossover to that? We have certification issues, so there's a whole host of pieces that I think need to be addressed through a strategy. It's got to tie into foreign policy, has to tie into in defense industrial policy, so you need to take the signals from everywhere, but again, my message is to all parties, this has got to be above politics. This has to be an all-of-nation effort, and you have a willing partner in industry to do this, but we need to come together, and those discussions are starting to happen, but we need to have the action flowing from that.
I certainly do think one of the key pieces of a defense industrial policy would be, you need CAF D&D to articulate the capabilities it needs for its force projection. So it comes from CFD, basically, Chief Force Development, and the CDS to articulate the CAF needs certain capabilities for it to force project in line with Canada's aspirations under its foreign policy. That's a starting point. And from there, you would say, how will we look at our current defense industrial base and identify capabilities that will enable that? And what capabilities are we missing that we will obtain perhaps from our allies and or that we want to build in this country for the future? Right? That is the foundation of the questions that you would ask when starting a defense industrial policy, in my opinion.
We've talked about procurement. We've talked about depoliticizing it. You've talked about today how you need that consistency beyond one government to another government, and so on. One would argue that then you're trying to create those sort of policies or long-term strategies almost in consensus. But would you argue then that it's preferable that parties, again, depoliticize and look to, on these very important issues, create things like, agreements or, go into partnerships. One may even say coalitions, I don't know, in order to ensure that we're serving and we're doing what's necessary to support the industries, to do what we need on the world stage, and to put ourselves at the back of that in favor of working together.
Look, I think on any subject, if you can have multi-party support, it's amazing. And I really liked the panel before us, the academic, I didn't catch his name, but saying that studies would show when there's 2-3 parties that have a consensus, then you're going to see the public follow and agree to make that a priority, whatever the topic is. So certainly, I think you're right to say everything you just said. In terms of the mechanisms of that, some of that would probably work. My gut would say that even just having the public dialogue, as simple as the discourse being, no, we're supportive of this, we recognize, party X, Y, and Z, that this is something we have to invest in. We're all working on this together would do the trick, frankly.
The government has estimated it would award a submarine contract 4 years from now with the first new submarine in the water a decade later. What can be done to expedite the process so our Navy could receive these new submarines in the water quicker?
Well, I do think some of the things that it's doing right now will help expedite the process. So by understanding that, by going around the world and understanding what our allies already have in an off-the-shelf procurement in this particular case, I think will expedite the capability in the hands of the Royal Canadian Navy. So I would say less bespoke, probably more off the shelf, but also understanding where Canadian industry will play to probably maintain and operate such a piece of asset will be incredibly important. So the release of the RFI most recently to gather that information and move forward on it, I think is incredibly important. The other thing that will need to be done in short order, probably in the next budget, is we'll have to see that money profiled actually within the budget, because right now you can't buy anything. You can't buy those submarines because you don't have any money earmarked for them.
You stay off the shelf, but there's no submarine sitting on a shelf somewhere. We don't even have the schematics done. So all told, what is the minimum, if there were a production line already in play that we could place an order in, is there a possibility we could get them sooner that way?
I have not looked into this as to, what country is most advanced in line with what our requirements say. You'd have to ask the Navy that question.
Now, the Prime Minister has said at the NATO summit that Canada will hit our minimum 2% spending by 2032 or within 8 years. And they're claiming a cabinet confidence to refuse to provide a plan. Are you confident in that estimate, or is it just a number they made up to placate our allies' frustration over our lack of contribution?
So that's not a plan. That's a press release. A plan would be a budget rollout year over year of funding for us to be able to get to 2% of GDP. And from an industrial perspective, we would see a matching investment plan, which would show the assets and the money profiled out in order to achieve 2% of GDP.
Mr. Pawlowski, final 3 minutes.
Supporting Ukraine in their war against Russia, I think, aligns with our strategic interests. Certainly one of the biggest challenges facing Ukraine at the moment is ammunition and the global shortage of 155 millimeter artillery shells. In the update, it mentions Canada will seek to accelerate the establishment of new artillery ammunition production capacity in Canada. I think we did give some money in March to IMT Defense and General Dynamics to look at expanding manufacturing. What are we doing to expand manufacturing of artillery shells, ammunition, specifically 155 millimeter artillery shells?
So currently, as I understand it, between the munitions supply program and the government contracting offices, there is a back and forth conversation with what the next generation of round would look like, how much Canada would be willing to purchase itself, because it needs to obviously purchase it and then either donate it or for what we need for our own stocks. And that conversation has been ongoing prior to the release of the DPU. So the sense of urgency that we would expect to make investments in this particular area, move it forward, and then contract out to industry is just not there in the way in which we're seeing it certainly in other nations. At this point, the Americans have made more investments in 155 and propellant in Canada than Canada has made in it. Next week, I will be at IMT for the opening of their new line for the Americans.
You've still got a minute.
Well, I guess the last question, and I was looking into production of 155 millimeter artillery shells. And do I have it totally screwed up? But how much does it cost to make one? How much do they sell for? I figured out about $7,000 a shell, which seemed incredible given the amount of shells that are being used. Is that an accurate figure?
Honestly, I don't know. I haven't done the math. All I look at is, there's about, I think, 6,000 rounds a day, 250,000 rounds a month that are being used by Ukraine, something along those lines. The numbers are astronomical.
Mr. Pulaski, unfortunately, I have to gavel this meeting to a close.